not part of our standard 7 in the introductory class, let's look at the dovetail. Dovetail is a lot like the finger joint, but fancier. Instead of having the fingers going straight back, and on this one going straight back, what we have is the shape of a dove's tail, hence the name dovetail, so that they are angled. And what that means is that these guys are also angled. And if we look at them this way, the pins also are angled. Now they're angled on a different dimension. So these guys are angled on the face, and those guys are angled on the ends. So they nestle together quite nicely. And what this means is that once they're in there, if I pull them in this direction, they won't disengage. They're locked in place. They will only disengage if I pull them in this dimension. Now this requires some adjustments to the way we do our layout, and we're going to introduce something besides the square. So the square does things at 90 degrees, hence the name, or 45 degrees. But we're also going to be using the T-bevel, which allows us to set an angle anywhere that we want it to be. Just with all other joints in this exercise, we start with our standard stock, ring it, and then cut on the waist side of the line so that we have our 2 halves again. Now let's take a look at my previously made sample. We have our 2 different layouts that we're going to need to do. One for the dovetails and one for the pins. The dovetails, notice the dovetails are square along the end, but then angled on the face. The pins are square on the face and then angled on the ends, which makes the square on this face different. And the angles here need to match the angles there. Let's start by choosing how big we want the dovetails and the pins to be, because if you notice, the dovetails are one size and the pins are a different size. So let's start with the dovetails, and that means putting our one piece in the bench vise and looking down on the end. Now we're going to choose how wide our dovetails are and how wide our pins are, and there are some basic guidelines, but really it comes down to your own aesthetics. So let's try to be symmetric about this. And since we have our 2-inch wide stock here, let's make our pins be a 1/4 inch in on this side and a 1/4 inch in on this side. And then let's make our, let's see about this. Let's see, what if our dovetails are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? What if that's 5/8? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah. Hey, look at that. So we can do a 1/4 inch and then a dovetail of 5/8, and then a 1/4 inch, dovetail of 5/8, and then a 1/4 inch. I think that'll look nice. So once we've dotted this, just like we did with the finger joints, we're going to turn these guys into lines that go straight across using our square. Now that's for the end. We also need to put these dovetails down onto the face. Now in the finger joints, the fingers were going straight back on both pieces. On the dovetail, they're not going to go straight back. They're going to be angled in slightly. What is that angle? Well, that's where the T-bevel comes in, because we can set this to any angle. And there are some standard angles to which we tend to set these things. These are guidelines. These are not hard and fast rules. For pine, the general guideline is a 1 to 6, so 1 inch over for 6 inches up. So we can take our ruler on a piece of scrap here. You could use paper or some of our scrap plywood, and let's pick a spot and then measure 1 inch over. So here's this guy, and then 1 inch, and then we'll get our square and measure up 6 inches, and then get our ruler and turn that into a triangle. Here we go. So we have our triangle where the base is 1 inch, the side is 6 inches, and now we can set our T-bevel so that it fits with the hypotenuse of our triangle. And we're going to need to make sure that we set this guy up like this so that we can work with our piece in the bench vise. And we want the lip flush against the edge of our scrap wood here. And we get our bevel part angled along the hypotenuse, and then we tighten this down. The second question that we're going to have is, how far down do we draw the dovetails? Well, we're going to do the same thing that we did for the rabbet and the finger joints and the tenon. And we're going to draw our shoulder line, getting our other piece flush with the end. I'm going to need to do that on both sides, as well as the edges, so that we have a ring around. And now we know how far down to draw and how far down to cut. So now let's use our T-bevel and draw our dovetails angled. Now we want to make sure that we draw our dovetail angles in the right direction. So we want them to be fat on the outside and then skinny on the inside. And these guys at the top are our pins, they are our waist. So we want to be angling in this direction for these guys. So we need to make sure that we orient our T-bevel in the right direction. So let's hold this here, and we have this guy angled, and we want our line to go from the end onto the face. Now if I just leave it like this, now I get two diagonal lines that are diagonal in the same way, and we don't want that. So we're going to come over here and skip this guy to the right side of the other dovetail, and then we're going to flip around our T-bevel and go in the opposite direction so that we have it angled in the opposite direction. It's the same angle, it's just angled the other way. All right, now we're going to flip this around and do this on the other side, making sure to mark off what is the waist. And we'll do the same thing over here. And we mark off the waist. And now we have our dovetails that we want to keep and our pins that we're going to cut out and get rid of. As usual, we have the same options that we've had for the finger joints. We can do it with a handsaw and then chisel, or we can do it with a scroll saw. For this one, since I've already shown the handsaw and the chisel, and I prefer the scroll saw, I'm going to do the scroll saw. As always, cut on the waist side of the line, and then for this middle guy, we're going to need to cut a relief cut into the waist so that we can cut along the shoulder. Now, just like with the mortise and tenon, we can do the layout for the pins based on what we've done with the dovetails. Just as we did with the mortise and tenon, where we use the tenon cut to lay out the mortise, we'll use the dovetails cut to lay out the pins. And I found it's easiest if I put my pin piece in the bench vise and then I get something on which to rest the dovetail piece so that I can have it nice and flat and I have my hands free for adjustment. And it's very important not to have the dovetail piece wonky, so you need to have these edges lined up. Square, the straight edge, any straight edge comes in handy for that, so you can have them lined up here. And once we have those lined up that way, we also need to get them lined up flush this way, and then hold that down so that it does not shift while we're making the lines. So we need to get our pencil in there, holding this guy down so that he doesn't shift at all. And we're drawing our layout lines from the dovetails here. Now we have our dovetails as cut marked on here. And in this case, we're going to want to get rid of those dovetails. Now, just like with the dovetail piece, we need to transfer these lines onto the face. And we also need to make sure that we have a shoulder so we know how deep to cut it. This time we can use a square to draw our line straight down, because remember, the pins are only angled on the edge and they are square to the faces. And then we need to make sure that we transfer the X's onto the faces in the right spot so that we can cut out the right part of it. And we want to cut it out so that those X's disappear from here and we can slide this guy in. Now, how are we going to do that? Again, we have a couple of options. We can take our back saw and cut down and then use chisels across the bottom. You could use a coping saw to do the same thing. You could even use the scroll saw to cut down, but you have to be very careful about this because you have to have this guy oriented in the right direction in order to do that. Notice how the scroll saw blade is straight up and down, and angling this is a possibility. We can tilt the table for the scroll saw. However, I don't recommend doing that because getting the angle of the table to line up with the angle of your dovetail is going to be very difficult. I find it far more reliable to just leave it straight up and down and make sure that you have the trapezoid of your dovetail set up so that the narrow lines are on the top and the wide lines are on the bottom. And notice how we're cutting into the waist by doing it that way. Again, it doesn't matter what happens to the waist, it's going away. What if we turn it upside down and then we cut on this line? Well, now we're cutting into the part of the wood that we want to keep. Notice how we're crossing the line there. Never cross lines. So we're going to cut it this way, and then we'll clear out that little triangle with a chisel. Now that we've cut out the bulk of the waist, we're going to use a chisel to finish off those angles. To use a chisel to chop out that little triangle there, we're going to need to not just chop straight down, we're also going to need to slice along the shoulder there. So it's probably easiest to use a slightly skinnier blade for the shoulder so that we can get a little bit farther in there. And as usual, both hands behind the blade, lay it flat against the shoulder and slice in there, making sure not to cut through the shoulder line. And then once you've done that, you can switch to a wider blade, and as usual, hold it with your fingers on the flat at the back, thumb on the bevel towards the waist side, and then chop straight down. Now any further cleanup of that dovetail hole is going to have to wait until after we get rid of this guy and we can start trying to fit it together. As usual, for using the back saw, you're going to put your thumb right on the line and then cut on the waist side of the line, and we're going to be cutting not perpendicular to the face this time, we're going to be cutting along that line at that angle there. We're going to need to make sure that we stay on the waist side of the line on the back side here, as well as the waist side of the line on the front side. So, as before, make a curve. All right, to get out the rest of that waist, we'll need to chop this out with our chisel, starting from this side, going part way down, and then flipping it over and finishing from that side, just like we did with the finger joint. As before, we want to start away from the line, work back towards the line a little bit, and get rid of that waist. We don't want to go on the line just yet because the bevel being pushed on this waist wood here would get pushed across the line and bruise these fibers. So in order to get a tight fit, we start far away and work back towards the line. Again, just like the finger joint. And we're only going to want to go about halfway through so we don't end up chopping into the tabletop. And then we popped it out, and it's time to clean this up, and we need to keep in mind that this is angled so that it's narrower at the bottom right now than it is at the top. So we're going to be very careful not to cut through those kerf marks from the saw that we put there. And to finish shaving down, we're going to flip that over and go at it from the other side. Notice we also have extra wood still on the waist side of the line. This is going to need to be cleaned up, and that can also be done with a chisel in the bench vise. All right, now just like with the finger joints, let's see how well these guys fit together and see what kind of cleanup needs to be done. Oh, that's feeling kind of tight. Do I need to do something, or can I just shove? Ooh, or was I putting it in upside down? Oh, that actually feels better. All right, now, just like with the finger joints, it's important to make sure that your pins are not getting narrower at the bottom or your dovetail is getting wider so that they force it and end up splitting it. So since this is feeling tighter as I'm pushing down, I think I'm going to want to shave down that bottom part a little bit more. All right, there we go. That's all the way in. Now, as I draw my thumb across this, there's a little bit of push out over on this side, so I think this shoulder needs to be cut down a little bit farther. All right, there we go. Let's glue this puppy up. Now, if you're just making a test joint like this and you have a nice tight fit, maybe you don't glue it and you just show off the fact that it will slide apart on its own and hold together on its own, and you don't need glue. But if you're making an actual box or a drawer, or you have gaps, you're gonna wanna glue it. So, just like with a finger joint, we're gonna want glue all over these puppies, as well as using a stick, because your fingers probably are not gonna fit in there. All right, look at that squeeze out. Now we're gonna wipe the squeeze out off. Now, like the finger joint, we're gonna wanna squeeze the pins in, but also we're gonna want to make sure it's seated all the way. So we're gonna clamp it in two directions. Once I get rid of this squeeze out. Notice we're getting a little more squeeze out, showing that the clamps really are helpful in making sure it's seated properly. And once you've got this, you can sign your work and then let it sit to dry.